Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Right now, all across the globe, humanity is locked in this ultimate clash.
The big one.
Right, the big one. It's a tension that has basically defined our modern era. You have the relentless, precise machinery of scientific reality just colliding head-on with the deeply ingrained, deeply human need for spiritual values.
Absolutely.
And we are constantly wrestling with the very concepts of God, the explosive rise of atheism, and our desperate search for meaning in a universe that science tells us is, just atoms and void.
Just gears turning.
Exactly. Why do we feel this friction so intensely? And what actually happens when we try to measure the weight of the human soul using the tools of a physicist?
It really is the defining conflict of our age, I think. We're caught in this bizarre tug-of-war trying to reconcile the objective world of measurable facts with the entirely subjective internal world of meaning and purpose.
And to figure out why that tug-of-war is happening, we are diving into a stack of incredibly rich source material today. We're looking at notes from Ludwig Wittgenstein's lectures on aesthetics and belief.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah, and we are pairing them with a profoundly insightful text by Mustafa Shakib Tunes, specifically his work, Towards a Philosophy of Religion.
It's such a fascinating pairing.
It is, because both of these thinkers are essentially trying to map out the exact borders of human understanding. Oh, and before we get fully into the weeds today, just a quick note for you tuning in. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
And I should probably jump in here to state our mission clearly before we wade into the deep end of these philosophical waters.
Please do.
Our goal today is to impartially explore how these two brilliant thinkers dissect the concepts of God, atheism, and human values. We are not here to take sides. We aren't endorsing any specific religious doctrines, nor are we advocating for atheistic or materialistic viewpoints. Whether the source texts touch on ideas that feel spiritually profound or highly skeptical, our only job is to unpack the fascinating ideas presented in the texts and serve them up for you to examine. We are just looking at the blueprints of human belief.
Let's start with those blueprints then. Tunes sets this massive foundational premise right at the beginning of his work, and it really sets the stage for the entire God versus atheism debate.
He really draws a hard line.
He points out a fundamental difference between two completely different realms of human experience. On one side, you have the scientific realm. This is the world of realities, the world of hard facts.
The measurable stuff.
Right. On the other side, you have the religious or philosophical realm, which deals entirely with values, or, as he terms it in Turkish, kimetler.
That distinction is everything. Tunes is arguing that science is entirely concerned with what is. It measures, it quantifies, it predicts the trajectory of a comet or the decay of a radioactive isotope. But religion and philosophy, they are concerned with what ought to be or what have ultimate worth, the kimetler. And if we connect this to the broader picture of the rise of skepticism and modern atheism, Tunes suggests that a massive amount of our contemporary existential doubt arises from what philosophers call a basic category error.
Right, a category error. It's like they try and use a thermometer to measure how loud a concert is.
Yes.
You're using the totally wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. It happens when people mistakenly try to apply scientific objective metrics to subjective spiritual values. If you try to prove or disprove a value using the scientific method, you're guaranteed to fail. And that failure breeds a profound skepticism.
It makes sense.
Think of it like trying to optimize a first date using a complex spreadsheet.
Oh, man.
Right. You can track the duration of eye contact, the cost of the meal, the ambient temperature of the restaurant, all perfectly accurate data. But if you use that data to calculate whether you are falling in love, you've committed a category error.
The physics are correct, but you've entirely missed the value of the experience.
And you'll probably end up alone.
That is a brilliant way to put it. You have all the data, but zero meaning. And this is exactly what Tunes says is happening on a cosmic scale.
Yeah.
When modern thinkers attempt to dissect the concept of God or the meaning of life using only the tools of a laboratory, they find the laboratory empty. And because they only trust the laboratory, atheism takes root as the seemingly logical conclusion.
Yes, and this is precisely where Wittgenstein's insights become incredibly relevant. He tackles this exact same category error, but through the lens of what he calls mechanisms.
The super mechanism idea.
Right. In his lectures, he warns us against the massive temptation of looking for a supermechanism in areas of human experience where mechanical logic simply does not belong.
Because physics is fundamentally practical.
Right.
It's the ultimate rule book of cause and effect.
Right. Wittgenstein compares physics to engineering. The goal is practical. We need to make sure a suspension bridge doesn't collapse under the weight of traffic.
Right. We absolutely need rigid mechanical logic for that.
We trace the cause, we calculate the effect. But applying that same rigid mechanical logic to something like human consciousness or the appreciation of a symphony or the concept of God, it's disastrous.
It just doesn't fit.
If you think you're going to find a hidden system of gears and pulleys that explains why a piece of music makes you weep, or why a believer feels the presence of the divine during prayer, you are looking for a super mechanism that simply doesn't exist.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because if we're saying science and values are just two completely different tools, isn't there a danger when they overlap?
What do you mean?
I mean, religion doesn't just stick to the realm of Keimetler, of values. It makes factual claims, too. If a historical religious text says a sea was literally parted or a person was physically resurrected, that isn't just a poetic value. That's a claim that a physical mechanism happened in the real world. How does Tunce reconcile that friction?
Yeah, that is the exact friction that drives the modern shift toward atheism, and it's a great question. Tunce's framework suggests that we get into trouble when we read ancient texts as if they were peer-reviewed biology or physics papers.
Right, they weren't writing for Nature magazine.
If you read a religious text as a failed textbook on cosmology, it is going to look absurd. The parting of a sea in a purely religious framework isn't meant to be evaluated as an anomaly in fluid dynamics. It's meant to communicate a profound value about liberation, divine protection, or ultimate authority.
So treating religion as a primitive version of science actually accelerates disbelief.
Precisely. Tunce argues that religion isn't a bad attempt at physics. It's a highly sophisticated system of meaning. When we judge it by the metrics of a modern science class, searching for the physical mechanism behind the parted sea, we inevitably end up discarding it.
Which leads us to the evolution of how humanity conceptualizes God. Think about the ancient Greeks.
Oh, perfect example.
They localized the divine. God was essentially a GPS coordinate. The gods physically lived on Mount Olympus.
Right. They were powerful, but they were part of the physical furniture of the universe. They were bound by spatial geometry.
But as human thought evolved, that spatial concept of the divine broke down. God couldn't just be an entity sitting on a mountain. The concept had to evolve into something omnipresent, non-spatial, and transcendent.
And to understand the limits of this new transcendent reality, Tunce brings in the philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Here we go.
Kant basically drew a massive line in the sand regarding human knowledge, dividing the universe into two realms, the phenomena and the noumena.
Okay, let's make sure we ground this for the listener, because Kant can get incredibly dense. The phenomena is what we can observe, right?
Exactly. The world of phenomena is everything science can measure. It's the wavelength of light, the firing of neurons in your brain, the gravitational pull of a planet.
The measurable data.
But Kant argued that science can only access phenomena. It can never access the thing in itself, what he called the intelligible world, or the noumena. So if you feel a profound sense of awe looking at the stars, Kant says science can perfectly measure your elevated heart rate and the dopamine in your brain, the phenomena.
But the actual profound meaning of that awe, the ultimate values or Keimetler,
that is locked away in the noumena, completely beyond our sensory perception.
So if I'm experiencing the divine, science can only measure the physical echo of it in my body, not the source. That creates a massive existential claustrophobia, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because as science advances, it maps more and more of the physical universe. We've sent probes past Pluto, we've peered deep into the quantum realm. The blank spaces on the map where humanity used to write, "Here be dragons" or "Here be God," get completely filled in with scientific facts.
Yes.
When no physical space is left for the divine to occupy, it paves the way for a purely materialistic worldview.
And that is the spark of modern atheism. When the universe is mapped and there is no spatial room left, the materialist concludes there is nothing else. Which brings us to the ultimate battleground between these two languages, the concept of miracles.
Science views miracles as absolute impossibilities, a breach of natural law. You can't have that. It breaks the mechanism, the bridge collapses.
But Tunce flips this entirely. He notes that in a truly religious mindset, you aren't looking for a magic trick that temporarily suspends gravity.
Right.
If God is the ultimate cause of everything, the fact that nature is consistent at all, the fact that gravity works every single day and the sun rises exactly when physics says it will, that is the miracle. The rule itself is the divine act, not the breaking of the rule.
That's a massive paradigm shift. Instead of God being the exception to the rule, God is the fact that there are rules at all.
Exactly.
But even with that perspective, there is this undeniable anxiety in the modern world, and it connects deeply to Wittgenstein's warnings about demystification. He was obsessed with how our scientific explanations can actually rob reality of its power.
Yes, Wittgenstein talked about this in relation to high-level mathematics, specifically Georg Cantor's theories of infinity.
Cantor's work is wild. If you aren't familiar with it, Cantor basically proved mathematically that there are different sizes of infinity.
Mind-bending.
Some infinities are literally larger than other infinities. It's the kind of concept that makes your brain hurt. It feels terrifying, almost divine, it has this mystical spiritual aura to it.
It does. It feels like you are brushing up against the mind of God. But Wittgenstein pointed out that you can take that exact same mind-bending mathematical reality and explain it in a completely dry, mechanical way using basic set theory.
Just reducing it.
You reduce it to equations on a chalkboard. And when you do that, the mystical charm vanishes. The aura is stripped away. The truth remains, but the wonder is dead.
And to illustrate how unsettling this demystification is, the source text brings in this incredible, highly atmospheric story by the Swiss writer Gottfried Keller. It's about a fly in a doll's head.
Oh, I love this part.
Walk us through this, because it is the perfect metaphor for what we are talking about.
It really is. In Keller's story, there are two children who catch a live fly. They bury this buzzing, frantic fly inside the hollow head of a doll, and then they run away.
So creepy.
Right. Wittgenstein uses this deeply eerie, uncanny image to point out humanity's psychological fascination with things that are hidden and secret. When you hold that doll and you hear it buzzing inside, it feels alive. It feels mysterious.
Like it has a soul.
The doll has a sacred, almost terrifying charm because you don't fully understand the mechanism of the noise.
The fly in the doll's head is the universe. We look up at the night sky, we know there is something buzzing inside, something hidden, and that gives existence a sacred mystery.
Exactly. But what happens when the scientific method comes along? Science is, by definition, the process of cracking open the doll's head to see what is making the noise.
And you find the fly?
You find the fly, and suddenly the mystery evaporates. It's just a biological insect. It's just a vibrating wing. It's a mechanism. If we connect this to the broader anxiety regarding atheism and religion today, this is the existential dread of the modern age. When science inevitably uncovers all the hidden flies of the universe, when we explain dark matter, consciousness, and the origins of the Big Bang, does the universe lose its sacred charm entirely?
That's the fear.
Are we left stranded in a purely mechanical, atheistic reality where nothing is sacred because everything is just gears and flies?
That is such a haunting prospect, a completely demystified universe where you know how everything works, but you have no idea what any of it means.
Yeah.
But Tunz gives us a truly fascinating counterargument to this dread. He suggests that humanity is incredibly resilient in how we construct meaning, even when the doll's head is cracked open. And to prove this, he doesn't just look at Western philosophy. He contrasts entirely different global paradigms. He looks closely at the architectural differences between Semitic religions and Buddhism.
This is one of the most compelling parts of Tunz's analysis. He shows how the geometry of our beliefs dictates our values. If you look at the Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they operate on a strictly linear timeline.
A straight line.
There is a definitive starting point, a creation, and history moves in a straight line toward a definitive endpoint, an apocalypse or a day of judgment.
And how did that linear timeline change a person's daily kaimeddler, their values?
It gives every single action massive historical and moral weight. In a linear framework, meaning is derived from moving forward along this timeline toward a divine culmination. Your choices matter because they are being recorded for a final judgment at the end of the line. The universe has a narrative arc.
But then Kuntz contrasts that with Buddhism, which operates on a completely different geometry of meaning. It's not a straight line, it's a circle.
Exactly. Buddhism isn't about a linear progression from creation to apocalypse. It's focused on the cyclical nature of time samsara and the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth. The goal in this framework isn't to reach the end of history to be judged favorably. The goal is to escape the endless churning cycle entirely to reach nirvana.
So the values radically shift. In the linear Semitic model, the highest value might be righteous action in the world to fulfill a divine plan. But in the cyclical Buddhist model, the highest value is detachment and the cessation of worldly desire.
Exactly.
Two entirely different sets of kaimeddler to deal with the exact same mysterious universe.
And that is the crux of Tunz's argument. Human beings are incredibly inventive in how we structure our search for ultimate reality. We build these massive, complex architectures of belief to house our values.
Which brings up a critical realization. The unifying thread through all of these frameworks, whether it's the linear timeline of the West, the cyclical timeline of the East, or even a strictly secular, scientific, atheistic worldview, is the persistent, undeniable need for values.
Yes.
The human thirst for Miller does not disappear just because you cracked open the doll's head and found the fly.
It absolutely does not. The object of reverence might change, but the psychological architecture of reverence remains entirely intact. Whether one believes in a literal God sitting outside of space and time, or one subscribes to a strictly materialistic atheism, humanity constantly seeks to elevate certain ideals to a sacred status.
Like a secular sacredness.
Exactly. A staunch atheist who entirely rejects the noumena might elevate the pursuit of scientific truth, or the necessity of human justice, or the preservation of beauty, to a level that functions almost identically to how a religious person views the divine.
They will defend those values with the same fervor as a zealot.
We have a profound, hardwired need to point to something in the universe and say, that is of ultimate worth. That is untouchable.
And I think it's vital to reiterate for you, our listener, the impartiality we promised at the start of this deep dive. Whether you interpret the world through the lens of a divine will orchestrating the cosmos, or through the lens of a purely materialistic atheism where we make our own meaning, our goal today isn't to declare a winner.
Definitely not.
We are just highlighting how philosophers like Wittgenstein and Tunz map the human mind. They are showing us the blueprints of our own desperate search for order. We aren't saying the religious framework is factually correct, nor are we saying the atheistic framework is the only rational adult choice. We're simply marveling at the architecture of the arguments themselves.
Because ultimately, both frameworks, the religious and the atheistic, are attempts to solve the exact same human problem.
Right.
How do we live in a universe that is so vast, so silent, and yet so full of things that feel incredibly important to us? How do we justify the love we feel, the art we make, and the morality we strive for in a universe made of atoms?
This is the ultimate puzzle. When you look at the entirety of what we've discussed today, from Tuntz's rigid separation of scientific facts and philosophical values to Wittgenstein's warnings about searching for a supermechanism, all the way to that haunting image of the fly in the doll's head.
Such a great image.
It really is.
Yeah.
It becomes incredibly clear that the great debate between God and atheism often feels like a collision of two completely incompatible languages. Trying to disprove the existence of God using only the rulebook of physics is exactly like trying to measure the emotional impact of a poem using a wooden ruler.
It's absurd.
It is. And on the flip side, trying to dictate the laws of biology or fluid dynamics using only moral theology is like trying to build a physical, load-bearing suspension bridge out of moral values.
It doesn't work.
The bridge will collapse. The mechanisms of the universe are fundamentally different from the meaning of the universe.
And that profound tension is exactly where the modern human condition lives. We are perpetually caught between the ruler and the poem. Which brings us to a final thought for you to take with you. Something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
I love this part.
If our scientific understanding of the universe eventually explains every physical mechanism, if we crack open every doll's head and explain every quirk of quantum gravity, every firing synapse of human consciousness, will the domain of values simply vanish into science? Or will our need for a philosophy of religion only grow stronger to explain why that perfectly understood universe exists in the first place?
A brilliant and slightly terrifying question to leave off on. The universe might eventually run like perfect predictable clockwork, but we still have to figure out why we care what time it is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring the mechanisms and the meanings, and we'll catch you on the next one.